Hello, good evening. Welcome to Novara Live. My name's Bastani. Happy New Year. Welcome to 2025. I'm joined tonight by the ever formidable Michael Walker. Michael, how are we?
Very well. I already did the Happy New Year yesterday. I don't know if you get to do it again.
Well, it's me, right? You did Happy New Year. Now I'm saying Happy New Year. People might not believe, on Twitter, people think we're the same person, I think. We have interchangeable opinions. Believe it or not, we are two autonomous individuals. We are. We really are. It's not fake news. Coming up on tonight's show, Justin Trudeau has resigned, Mark Zuckerberg ends fact-checking at Meta, and Andrew Tate has started a political party. He has pretensions of one day being Prime Minister. Stay tuned for all of that and more. Earlier this week, ex-owner Elon Musk reignited a row over grooming gangs in England. It began when Safeguarding Minister Jess Phillips rejected a call from Oldham Council for the government to hold a public inquiry into grooming gangs. Instead, Phillips told Oldham it should launch its own independent inquiry into potential failings by Oldham authorities, just as other towns like Rochdale, Rotherham and Telford had done previously. That was enough for Elon Musk to demand Phillips be jailed. Yes, jailed, labelling British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, quote, complicit in the rape of Britain, when head of the Crown Prosecution Service and calling on King Charles to dissolve Parliament. Musk's storm of disinformation has been welcomed by figures like Tommy Robinson, but other more mainstream politicians have sensed a political opportunity too. On Monday, former Tory leadership hopeful Robert Jenrick posted this. Starmer's government has launched more than 60 reviews since taking office, but won't launch a national inquiry into rape gangs. Why? There is no acceptable excuse. Unlike during the last government, Oldham Council have now requested government support, and they say they're not best placed to conduct a review. Victims now demand a national inquiry. Previous reviews have looked at specific places and elements of the scandal, but nothing has explored it in totality. Such grave state failure warrants the same form of national inquiry we've undertaken in the past. Nothing less is acceptable. Jenrick has now appeared on the Today programme. His party, of course, was in power throughout the period during which the grooming gangs were uncovered. In fact, Jenrick was a Home Office minister under Rishi Sunak. Naturally, he was asked whether he thought successive Conservative governments had done enough to protect young girls from sexual exploitation.
Are you willing to say now that your party in government got it wrong? You didn't do it enough when it came to protecting young women and girls from child abuse?
Well, look, there are young women who are subjected to this appalling violence and torture today. That is what the victims are telling us. So could we have done more? Should we do more now? Yes, absolutely. We have to root this out. We did do a lot in government. We know about this in part because of the reviews commissioned by Theresa May as Home Secretary, the work of Sajid Javid when he ensured that there was better data, including by ethnicity, the work of Suella Braverman as Home Secretary, who created the Grooming Gangs Task Force, which has led to 550 arrests and protected over 4,500 victims. There has been significant work, but more clearly needs to be done.
Well, we'll turn to what more needs to be done in future, but let's just focus on what you've just said. You could have done more. You in government over the last 14 years could have done more. Why did Conservative ministers refuse the request from Oldham Council to have the national inquiry, which you now say Labour ought to do?
Well, no, that's not right, Nick. The previous request that came from Oldham Council was by a small number of local councillors. The request that has come to this new Labour government is a different one. This is from the council itself.
Did the Conservatives set up an inquiry into what was happening in Oldham when you were in government?
No, because there was not a request. No, but Nick, we must make this clear. There was not a request from the council itself.
So that's a former minister, a minister in the cabinet, saying that the national government of the UK didn't hold a public inquiry into child sexual exploitation because a specific local council didn't ask for it. If they'd asked for it, then we would have done it. Who knew that the Tories in Westminster, the national government, only danced to the tune of local councillors? That's the first time I've ever heard that said by anyone anywhere. Now, there has been one national inquiry into child sexual abuse in the UK. It wasn't focused on grooming gangs, but it did include in its remit group exploitation of children. After a 7-year investigation, it released its conclusions, revealing extensive failures by councils, police, and the government to tackle grooming. And a central finding was that across the country, victims of grooming were not taken seriously by the authorities, and indeed they were often blamed for their own abuse. The chair of that report, Alexis Jay, who had also chaired the groundbreaking inquiry into Rotherham grooming gangs in 2013, made 20 recommendations as a result. Nick Robinson went on to ask Jenrick about those recommendations.
Why did the Conservatives in power not implement the findings of the independent inquiry into child abuse?
Well, firstly, we have the two central recommendations of the review were being taken forward by the last Conservative government. In
Taken
fact,
forward? They
are
are
the
not
two
implemented,
things which
Mr.
Yvette
Jenrick. They
Cooper
are being
said
implemented
yesterday.
by this government.
Well, they are the things that we were taking forward. We drafted the legislation. It was in the criminal justice bill. It was before Parliament, but fell away as a result of the general election.
Hold on, you've been in government for 14 years. The first reports
the review
of
only
abuse
came
were
out in 2022, Nick.
Well, that was your decision about when to set up an inquiry. The first reports of mass grooming and arrests were in 2010. The first inquiry into Rotherham Council was in 2014. The report in Greater Manchester to a police cover-up was in 2020. So if there was a delay setting up an inquiry into child abuse, would you like to accept that was a delay by Conservative ministers in a Conservative government?
No, Nick. Look, you asked me, were we taking forward the recommendations of the Jay review that was reported in 2022? The answer is yes. The two central recommendations were being legislated for by Parliament under the last Conservative government.
Robert Jenrick is completely full of it. In 2023, chair of the inquiry, Alexis Jay, slammed the then Conservative government for its underwhelming response to her findings after it only partially accepted a small number of her recommendations. At the time, Jay said this: "We are deeply disappointed that the government has not accepted the full package of recommendations made in the final report. In some instances, the government has stated that a number of them will be subject to consultations, despite the extensive research and evidence-taking which the inquiry carried out over 7 years. The package announced by the government will not provide the protection from sexual abuse that our children deserve." Now, one of those recommendations was that if a child tells an adult about what is happening to them, that they're being sexually exploited, reporting that then to authorities should be mandatory. It's kind of unbelievable that that wasn't already the case. Last night, as Labour's Home Secretary Yvette Cooper promised a new law later this year that would make covering up or failing to report child exploitation a criminal offence. But you have to wonder, what stopped the Tories from bringing that into law immediately in 2022? Also on the Today programme, chair of the Child Abuse Inquiry, Alexis Jay, was asked about the impact of the Tories failing to enact her recommendations.
What would be different if those two policies were in place now and if another Oldham or another Rotherham were to happen?
Well, of course, the recommendations that we made in the final report covered all aspects of child sexual abuse and were the big overarching issues. So they should apply to everything, and not only to child sexual exploitation, but of course including it. And one of the more important aspects of what the Home Secretary announced yesterday, of course, was mandatory reporting. Now, in the public inquiry, we always asked the many, many victims with whom we were in contact, especially those who were witnesses, what would have made a difference to your dreadful experience. And we heard so often that when they plucked up the courage to talk to a trusted adult, they expected something to happen that would stop the abuse, and it didn't.
And Jay went on to point out that not only had the Tories failed to carry out her recommendations, but the local councils had still not enacted some 400 of her findings. So what did she make of the idea of a new national inquiry? Here's what Jay said.
Well, I think that the time has passed for more inquiries. We've had enough of inquiries, consultations and discussions, and especially for those victims and survivors who've had the courage to come forward, and there are many of them, across the piece in child sexual abuse, not simply in child sexual exploitation. And they clearly want action, and we have set out what action is required, and people should just get on with it locally and nationally.
Do you think it would hinder the implementation of the measures you want to see if there were another inquiry?
It would certainly cause delays.
So you're clear you're not in favour of that. What do you make of those people making the calls then for another inquiry? Do you think they are, to use a phrase that was used on your behalf yesterday by supporters of a campaign group called ACT on the IICSA, in other words, the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, do you think they are guilty of politicising this issue?
I would not attribute that to everyone, but I've certainly been very unhappy about the politicisation of child sexual exploitation and child sexual abuse in the way that many people, sometimes in a very uninformed way, have waded into the argument. I've heard very little in the public discourse that's taken place in the last few days, if you could dignify it with that description, that have mentioned children and the appalling and lifelong effects that child sexual abuse can have on people.
And can Robert Jenrick be counted amongst those people politicising the issue of child sexual exploitation at the expense of its victims? Well, let's go back to his interview on the Today programme.
Nick, I have been arguing for some time that we should have, for example, full life sentences for the perpetrators. I've been saying that if they're foreign nationals, they should be deported from our country. No ifs, no buts. That the cowardly public officials and councillors who covered this up
Did you
should
raise
be
it when you were a Home
prosecuted.
Office Minister?
Look, I wrote about this last year.
Did you raise it when you were a Home Office Minister?
When I was Home Office Minister with Suella Braverman, we did take forward.
Did you raise it when you were a Home Office Minister, Mr. Jenrick?
Well, I did discuss this with the Home Secretary, but it wasn't my portfolio. I did discuss it.
Did you raise it in the House of Commons?
Nick, I wrote about this last year, and I was criticised for it.
Yes, I've checked Hansard today, and it's not a perfect test. When you put in the name Robert Jenrick, grooming, no mention. Grooming gang,
I wrote about
no
this,
mention.
Nick, I wrote about this last year.
No mention. Oldham,
I wrote
no
about
mention.
This, Nick, last year.
Rochdale,
and
no
was
mention.
criticised by the
Child
media
sexual
for doing
abuse,
so.
no mention, Mr. Jenrick. Child rape, no mention. You have not raised, or have you? Please correct me if my search is wrong. The issue of mass gang rape and child sex abuse that you're so energised about, you have no evidence you raised it as a minister and no evidence that you've raised it in the House of Commons.
Look, Nick, I wrote about this last year and was criticised by the media for doing so.
Now, Robert Jenrick did briefly speak about grooming gangs last year. He indeed did call for whole life sentences for those involved in child sexual exploitation and automatic deportations for non-British offenders. That sudden interest in grooming gangs emerged while he was running for Tory party leader, a competition he ultimately lost to Kemi Badenoch. And of course, there wasn't a word about the victims there, nor about any of the child protection recommendations made by Alexis Jay, and which have been pretty much ignored by his government. Michael, this has obviously been a story that's been in the headlines now for several days, really, since, Saturday, maybe even before then, actually, when Musk started to tweet about this and really shining a spotlight on it again. No problem in that. Hugely important story. That matters. But listening to those excerpts with Robert Jenrick, it does feel that certain UK politicians are intervening in this issue, perhaps for self-interested reasons.
I think it's very, very, very obvious that Robert Jenrick is exploiting this issue for his own personal gain, not just to attack Keir Starmer, but I think because he has his own ambitions to become Tory leader, potentially to make some kind of deal with reform. That seems to be the 5-year plan from him. Of course, as you've said, as we talked about on yesterday's show as well, it's not just Musk's interest in this story, but also reporting from court cases that I think has reignited interest in this story. And it is a really serious story. It shouldn't be swept under the carpet. But there is something very disingenuous about the attempt by Robert Jenrick to say this had been swept under the carpet, right? We heard from Alexis Jay there, who seems like a very impressive woman. And it's important to sort of say what the actual controversy is about now, because you've got the Conservatives who seem to be saying, we need a national inquiry specifically into these grooming gangs. Now, they could have done that in the 14 years they were in government. Now, I assume the reason they didn't do that is because it makes more sense to look in the round at child sexual exploitation. Now, that's what the Alexis Jay report did. It cost £200 million. It took 7 years. It had all sorts of different modules. So some of the modules were on abuse within the Catholic Church, for example. There was another module on exploitation, group exploitations in public places by gangs, which basically sort of included the grooming gangs within it. Now, what the far right seem to want to do is they want to say this is a type of sexual abuse which is completely different to any other type of sexual abuse and therefore should be dealt completely separately with. Now, Alexis Jay says that's not a good idea. She's already written her report. She wants the recommendations should just be implemented. Also worth noting, the argument from sort of Kemi Badenoch, from some of the GB News journalists, from Robert Jenrick, is that the general inquiry into child sex exploitation, wasn't fully aware of the child grooming scandals, didn't look properly into it. Now, it's really important to emphasize here, the person who ran the general inquiry into child sexual exploitation was exactly the same person who ran the specific inquiry into grooming or child rape gangs, or whatever we want to call them, in Rotherham. So the person who ran that inquiry was someone who'd already written a very hard-hitting inquiry into the child grooming scandal, which, people who sort of bring up this issue a lot, they're always quoting from that report because, as I say, it was a very hard-hitting report. So the idea this hasn't been covered, this hasn't been discussed, is silly, I think. Robert Jenrick's claim that they couldn't start a national inquiry into grooming because one particular council hadn't asked them just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. This is clearly troublemaking from Elon Musk and the likes of Tommy Robinson. And I think what is sort of especially depressing is the extent to which UK media organisations, and of course the Tory party, I mean, that's sort of the most frightening here. But for example, the Daily Telegraph today had their big headline, Keir Starmer refers to a national inquiry into grooming gangs as far right. Now, obviously, if you read that, you think, oh my God, that's disgraceful. He's saying that anyone concerned with grooming gangs is far right. And he thinks the idea of having an inquiry into grooming gangs is far right. That would be a bit outrageous. He didn't say that whatsoever. What he said is he wasn't going to be bullied by people who are flirting with the far right. Elon Musk literally keeps tweeting free Tommy Robinson. If that's not the definition of flirting with the far right, I don't know what is, and who is sharing lots of misinformation. So you've got some troublemakers trying to make this story or mislead people about this story, essentially, because we have had inquiries, and you've got a lot of opportunists who are very much willing to jump on board with this. And we are hearing very little about the actual victims of this. And in part because there have been, I think it's perfectly reasonable to argue that this could have been covered more, but it was covered, right? Yesterday, we showed clips from a really important BBC documentary called The Betrayed Girls, which was from 2017 about this scandal. So the idea that, this has been silenced for 14 years, even though the Tories were in government, and now we have to have a national inquiry into this specific form of sexual exploitation, because the far right see this as the one form of sexual exploitation where they can really say there might be an ethnic dimension. I think the whole thing is quite disgusting.
Yeah, I really do agree with that. I mean, the Telegraph has never been my newspaper of choice, but it has just become an extraordinary publication, really since Labour have taken office. There is now, I think, the lurch into just outright disinformation. And I use that term guardedly. It's a favoured term by the liberal establishment, often in trying to mischaracterise and undermine accurate reporting or just a point of view. But it is that. It's telling people a certain perspective in order to anger them constantly. I'm not even going to say every day. It's every several hours there's a news story to upset people who didn't vote for Labour in the last election. And this idea that people who voted for Keir Starmer, people who voted for Labour are now getting really angry. They're angry not because of the stories in the Telegraph, right? It's stories aimed at people who voted for the Tories or for reform at the last election, and to get them angrier and angrier and angrier, not just on this, but on a whole raft of issues, sometimes partly justified, of course. And it's really quite extraordinary to watch. And, some people in the comments might be thinking, look, focus on the issue that matters, which of course is the grooming. I would say, I agree. So let's enact those 20 recommendations before talking about another national inquiry. As Alexis Jay herself said, if you have another inquiry, at best, it's going to delay the implementation of those recommendations. It might even undermine them. That to me seems utterly extraordinary. Now remember, that was commissioned by Theresa May in 2015. So that's something that a Tory did as Home Secretary about this situation. They did nothing for the preceding 9 years they were in government. And Yvette Cooper announcing what she did last night as Labour Home Secretary is more in one night, and I'm not a big fan of this Labour government, as I'm sure many of you are aware. She did more in one night than the Tories have done on this issue in 9 years of government. And yet the Telegraph runs headlines like that. Absolutely extraordinary. Yesterday, Justin Trudeau, Canada's Prime Minister, announced his resignation. Trudeau first got the top job in Canadian politics in November 2015 after his Liberal Party came first in federal elections. That marked a stunning success as the party went from 36 seats to 184, and in so doing, achieving a parliamentary majority. That was before the first Trump presidency and before Brexit. Barack Obama was still the president. Feels like a long time ago. The Liberals proceeded to come first in both the 2019 and 2021 federal elections, although both times they received fewer votes than their rivals, the Conservative Party. In a moment, I'll be speaking to Martin Lukács from Canadian outlet The Breach. But before I do, I want to show you this. I think it's the most memorable clip of Trudeau's time in office.
We came here today to ask you to also look into the policies that religious charitable organizations have in our legislation so that it can also be changed, because maternal love is the love that's going to change the future of mankind. So we'd like you to look into
we like to say people kind, not necessarily mankind, because it's more inclusive.
There we go, exactly. Yes, thank you.
We can all learn from each other.
I know he's kind of joking there, but he's also not, right? He's also not. That was like the apogee. That was the pinnacle of like woke liberalism. The pinnacle. I'm pretty sure, we still had BuzzFeed, right? We still had Vice. We still thought that liberal millennials would change the world. Feels like a million years ago, but it wasn't. Earlier today, I spoke to Martin Lukács, a journalist at the Canadian outlet The Breach. I started by asking why Trudeau resigned now, given that before Christmas, he was saying that he would stay and fight the next election.
I think reality finally dawned on Justin Trudeau and his advisors, who had become increasingly bunkered as his polling numbers cratered and support among his caucus fell apart. Just before the holidays, his closest and longest parliamentary ally, his finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, resigned, and the dam kind of finally broke. The grumblings of his caucus, which had been more muted the last few months, as several of them had anonymously called for his resignation, then became a full-blown mutiny. And I think there's actually an analogy to Biden. Like Biden, Trudeau held on too long, suffering from, delusions about the problems being external to him and his party. It was always, for the Liberal Party, somebody else's fault. And I think that finally fell apart.
That's really interesting. Can you tell me a little bit more about that now former finance minister and the reasons why she left just before Christmas?
She put out a letter just before the holidays in which she accused him of engaging in cheap political gimmicks. As the Liberal Party's support has fallen apart, they have, desperately tried to turn the tide. And the latest move, which apparently she did not support, was to send out checks to Canadians who make less than $150,000, which would, of course, have taken a huge chunk out of government revenue. I think it would have been something along the tune of $6 billion. And as she put it, with the looming threat of tariffs from Trump on Canada, she felt that the powder should be kept dry. and that there shouldn't be careless fiscal spending of that sort.
The talk of tariffs before the US election in November was purely speculative. Now it's looking like a reality, not just, of course, for Canada, but for places like Germany too. Massive implications for their car industry. How big is that issue of tariffs looming in terms of the broader political conversation in Canada?
Yeah, it does loom large. Trump has said he'll impose 25% tariffs on all Canadian imports. The Canadian economy is deeply reliant on the US. A little bit more than 80% of our exports go there. So such tariffs would be devastating to the Canadian economy. I still personally suspect that Trump will not follow through on the threat, but like a smart negotiator, he's using them to win concessions, especially on border security. So even before Trudeau suspended Parliament, his government had already committed to spending more than $1 billion on helicopters and such to monitor the border in response to Trump. Trump is also evidently enjoying himself. He's been trolling Trudeau in Canada by suggesting the country become the 51st state. And in turn, sections of the Canadian political class have, been embarrassing themselves by twisting themselves in knots to offer Trump whatever it is he wants. But day to day, I think most Canadians are still mostly concerned with, escalating bills and a crisis of affordability, which to me gets at the more underlying reasons for the disenchantment with Trudeau's 10 years in power and is a better explanation for the drop in the polls that he's suffered.
Generally speaking, how would you assess Trudeau's tenure as premier in a moment, in an era of real political instability? Him being in his position for 9 years is a really long time. What's his legacy? What's his impact on Canada? And what does it mean, that Trudeau era, going forward into 2025 and beyond?
Once upon a time, Trudeau was really seen as this torchbearer of progressive neoliberalism, a kind of darling of Davos. When he first swept into power in 2015, he was this shining telegenic avatar. He promised bold climate action. He appointed a gender-balanced cabinet. He used to take his shirt off at every discernible opportunity. The Liberal Party is one of the world's most successful liberal formations. They've ruled Canada for most of the country's existence. And what's interesting is that Canadians are actually overwhelmingly social democratic in orientation, but the Liberals have succeeded by always campaigning left and governing right, acting as a kind of shock absorber for the discontent that has, bubbled up, a shock absorber for the corporate class. And Trudeau was a natural born deployer of this formula. He really excelled at, probably better than anyone, I would say, around the world, at choreographed gestures of defiance against the very economic order that he then ultimately sought to defend. So, during Black Lives Matter, he took a knee. In the wake of an Indigenous uprising in Canada, he offered, profuse apologetic tears. During the Syrian refugee crisis, he doled out hugs at the airport. All meanwhile, he made a very quiet compact with sections of the corporate and business elite, promising to be a savvy salesman for the tar sands that we have in this country. Handouts continued to corporations, never more so than during the pandemic when big business received billions and billions. He opened up public projects to private delivery and profit. And he did make some concessions. It should be acknowledged. He tinkered at the edges. There was a $10 a day childcare program, which is probably his signal achievement. The beginnings of universal pharmacare and a means-tested dental care program. But the Liberal Party in Canada was never really willing or even able to offer a compelling answer to the crises that are roiling the country of unaffordability, of climate breakdown, of racism. And so today, Canada suffers from, after 9 years of his rule, Canada suffers from the highest rate of inequality in its history. Food bank use is at a record high. Housing prices are through the roof. And in the face of these evident failures of establishment liberalism, the right wing in Canada has really capitalized. They've channeled the anger and disenchantment that exists in this country toward record poll numbers.
I have to say, I was in Vancouver a few years ago, and the levels of deprivation shocked me. Opioid use as well. Well, I mean, that's for a number of reasons, of course. British Columbia has more clement weather, so people with addiction issues are more likely to be there than a colder part of the country. But it really struck me, the kinds of crises that Canada is going through right now, and was so at odds with the image often projected internationally by Mr. Trudeau. Who's now the most likely person in the Liberal Party to succeed Justin Trudeau as leader of that party, if not, of course, Prime Minister of the country after the forthcoming election?
The party now is scrambling. They have really only a few months before they need to call an election or before the government will fall. So they have an expedited leadership process. We don't know the exact terms of it yet. But what we do know is that there really aren't any good alternatives to Justin Trudeau. The frontrunners appear to be Mark Carney, a supposed rock star banker who, Novara's listeners might know as the former governor of the Bank of England, and Trudeau's, backstabbing former finance minister, Chrystia Freeland. They are the frontrunners. The thing is that both of them, even more so than Trudeau, come across as elite, out of touch, and they will be a perfect foil, I think, to Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, a very savvy and skilled politician who has cultivated a persona as an anti-establishment maverick.
You mentioned Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party. They're leading by 20 points in the polls right now. What's his political offer? Is he similar to a European national populist? Is he closer to Trump? How should we, this side of the Atlantic, read him and his politics?
I think he's actually best understood as a campus conservative libertarian whose views have basically been unchanged since he was 19 and first introduced to Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman. He is a hardcore ideologue. And despite being literally a career politician who was first elected when he was 24 years old, he has very recently, been able to rebrand himself with the help of a gullible establishment media here in Canada as a friend of the working class who's out to challenge the country's elite. So, as you say, very much, pulling from a classic fake right-wing populist playbook. And I think, the current tragedy of Canadian politics is that while this liberal formula has been unraveling, there really is a moment for a challenge from the left, from the socialist left. Nearly 60% of Canadians polled say they have a positive attitude towards socialism. But the NDP, which is the, ostensibly formerly Social Democratic party, has not been able to mount a, formidable challenge to Trudeau. In fact, the last three years, they propped up his government and now are wearing some of his unpopularity. And they did become a bit of a Blairite political formation that doesn't really offer more than milquetoast, social democratic proposals. Meanwhile, the man who has seized the moment is Poilievre, who is deeply invested in a, right-wing neoliberal project, who is out to gut what remains of Canada's welfare state, and further unshackle corporate power to do as it wishes. So in Canada, we are looking down the barrel of probably the most radical right-wing government that has ever operated in Canada.
On January 7th, 2021, one day after violent protests beset the Capitol building in Washington, Facebook suspended Donald Trump's account for the remaining duration of his presidency. A few months later, in June, Facebook announced a 2-year suspension for Trump's accounts, effective from that initial suspension date at the start of the year. 2 years later, in January 2023, those accounts were reinstated by Facebook, or rather now Meta, with the purported risk to public safety having, quote, sufficiently receded. Now, predictably, this all caused a fair amount of bad blood between the Trump camp and Meta. Indeed, in August last year, Trump went as far as threatening the Meta CEO with life from prison if he meddled in the forthcoming election, something which Trump claimed had happened 4 years earlier. Trump wrote this in his book, Save America, published last year. He told me there was nobody like Trump on Facebook. If he, of course, is talking about Zuckerberg here. Trump is talking about himself in the third person. But at the same time, and for whatever reason, steered it against me. We are watching him closely, and if he does anything illegal this time, he will spend the rest of his life in prison, as will others who cheat in the 2024 presidential election. Forget the jury system. I will make sure he spends the rest of his life in prison. By the way, he's talking about one of the wealthiest people on earth there. Extraordinary. It has since been acknowledged by Zuckerberg that not only did Facebook block adverts alleging election fraud after the 2020 election, but more importantly, it also demoted a potentially damaging New York Post story about Joe Biden's son, Hunter. So, with relations between Meta and the incoming president anything but cordial, it wasn't a surprise when former Lib Dem leader Nick Clegg announced his resignation last Thursday. Zuckerberg had appointed Clegg as Vice President of Global Affairs and Communications in 2018. The reasoning behind that appointment was the view that Clegg was well suited to fix Facebook's reputation in the aftermath of the Cambridge Analytica story. He could soothe regulatory issues in Europe while also being able to deal with Republican and Democratic politicians in a specific and unique way in the US, in the way that a US national might not be able to. I don't have a side. I'm British. But Clegg was also deeply implicated in the decision to ban Trump. Thus, the clock was ticking for him as soon as it was confirmed that Kamala Harris had lost last November. But Clegg's exit last week was merely the preface to the real story, which is a 180-degree turn by Zuckerberg himself on censorship. Earlier today, the Meta CEO published a video on Facebook announcing some changes that are forthcoming. Zuckerberg started by saying how Meta will return its focus to free expression.
Hey everyone, I want to talk about something important today, because it's time to get back to our roots around free expression on Facebook and Instagram. I started building social media to give people a voice. I gave a speech at Georgetown 5 years ago about the importance of protecting free expression, and I still believe this today. But a lot has happened over the last several years. There's been widespread debate about potential harms from online content. Governments and legacy media have pushed to censor more and more. A lot of this is clearly political, but there's also a lot of legitimately bad stuff out there. Drugs, terrorism, child exploitation. These are things that we take very seriously, and I want to make sure that we handle responsibly. So we built a lot of complex systems to moderate content. But the problem with complex systems is they make mistakes. Even if they accidentally censor just 1% of posts, that's millions of people. And we've reached a point where it's just too many mistakes and too much censorship. The recent elections also feel like a cultural tipping point towards once again prioritizing speech. So we're going to get back to our roots and focus on reducing mistakes, simplifying our policies, and restoring free expression on our platforms.
And next up, Zuckerberg explained what all of that means in practice.
First, we're going to get rid of fact checkers and replace them with community notes, similar to X, starting in the US. After Trump first got elected in 2016, the legacy media wrote nonstop about how misinformation was a threat to democracy. We tried in good faith to address those concerns without becoming the arbiters of truth. But the fact checkers have just been too politically biased and have destroyed more trust than they've created, especially in the US. So over the next couple of months, we're going to phase in a more comprehensive community notes system.
Sound familiar? Community notes system. Legacy media being bashed? He sounds just like one Elon Musk. Let's look at another parts of Zuckerberg's video.
We're going to simplify our content policies and get rid of a bunch of restrictions on topics like immigration and gender that are just out of touch with mainstream discourse. What started as a movement to be more inclusive has increasingly been used to shut down opinions and shut out people with different ideas, and it's gone too far. So I want to make sure that people can share their beliefs and experiences on our platforms.
So we've now gone to a Musk X-style content moderation policy. We're not going to have fact-checking. We're going to have community notes. And he's also overtly saying that actually you can say things that previously weren't being allowed on things like immigration and gender. He doesn't say specifically what, but you can use your imagination. Back to Zuckerberg.
We're changing how we enforce our policies to reduce the mistakes that account for the vast majority of censorship on our platforms. We used to have filters that scanned for any policy violation. Now, we're going to focus those filters on tackling illegal and high-severity violations. And for lower severity violations, we're going to rely on someone reporting an issue before we take action. The problem is that the filters make mistakes, and they take down a lot of content that they shouldn't. So by dialing them back, we're going to dramatically reduce the amount of censorship on our platforms. We're also going to tune our content filters to require much higher confidence before taking down content. The reality is that this is a trade-off. It means we're going to catch less bad stuff, but we'll also reduce the number of innocent people's posts and accounts that we accidentally take down.
We're going to go back to Zuckerberg in a minute, but bear in mind, everything he's saying here, he's saying, there'll be less moderation, there'll be more peer review by users. They're going to save a lot of money, right? You can lay off quite a few people. You can probably use quite a lot of AI. So the idea that this is just about free speech is also about the bottom line. And it's about being able to reduce headcount, which, by the way, X has done to an extraordinary extent. And Meta's probably looking at that and thinking, hey, maybe we can reduce headcount by 30%. That would be really useful as a business. Zuckerberg outlined the last two changes that Meta would be introducing, the most interesting of which was that the company would be moving its content moderation from California to Texas. That's right, the same state where Elon Musk moved X-Core in September last year. So we've now got community notes, and Meta is literally going to the same state where X is. Could you get any more obsequious? After announcing those changes, Zuckerberg finished by saying this.
Finally, we're going to work with President Trump to push back on governments around the world that are going after American companies and pushing to censor more. The US has the strongest constitutional protections for free expression in the world. Europe has an ever-increasing number of laws institutionalizing censorship and making it difficult to build anything innovative there. Latin American countries have secret courts that can order companies to quietly take things down. China has censored our apps from even working in the country. The only way that we can push back on this global trend is with the support of the US government. And that's why it's been so difficult over the past 4 years when even the US government has pushed for censorship. By going after us and other American companies, it has emboldened other governments to go even further. But now we have the opportunity to restore free expression, and I am excited to take it. It'll take time to get this right, and these are complex systems. They're never going to be perfect. There's also a lot of illegal stuff that we still need to work very hard to remove. But the bottom line is that after years of having our content moderation work focus primarily on removing content, it is time to focus on reducing mistakes, simplifying our systems, and getting back to our roots about giving people voice. I'm looking forward to this next chapter. Stay good out there, and more to come soon.
Feel good, happy, this is great, civil liberties, freedom of speech. Forget the fact I'm going to be able to save billions of dollars. Forget the fact I'm relocating the business to a state where there isn't even full bodily autonomy for women. Don't worry about that. We are looking after your right to free speech. Michael, what did you make of Zuckerberg's newfound support for free speech fundamentalism and the fact he's going to Texas? It's not even subtle, is it? Let's be honest.
Yeah, I mean, it looked a bit like he was reading a script that someone else had written. I mean, I suppose it probably was one of his underlings, but it looked like it could have been Elon Musk or Donald Trump or whoever. I don't use Facebook enough to really know what these changes would mean. Personally, I actually think that community notes was the only good thing that Elon Musk did with X. I think sort of what ruined X was having an owner who was constantly sharing misinformation, far-right misinformation, and the way that sort of the monetization of it meant that people were really, really incentivized to put out just complete crap and monetize it and earn money from it. That was basically Elon Musk's vision for the platform, which is why it's just full of complete crap. Right. I don't know what community notes would mean for Facebook, but actually the sort of Wikipedia model of fact checking, I think, is probably more effective than the top down. Let's leave it to a corporate department to do it. So I've actually got no problem with that. We'll have to see in practice what it looks like. I think politically, what this shows is how different Trump's second term in office is going to be to his first, right? Because compare this to 2018, right? 2018, Trump had already been in power for 2 years, and still all of these corporations were sort of struggling to say, how did we let this guy in? Well, he was president, right? So Facebook employs Nick Clegg, clearly a massive liberal, while Donald Trump is president. And you had all of these corporations who didn't want to sort of publicly associate themselves with the president because they thought that could have financial costs for them because he was so unpopular among huge parts of the American electorate because he was so divisive. He wasn't good for business. What you're going to see over the next 4 years is not only has Donald Trump within his own team managed to get people who are more aligned with his project, but the entire American establishment seems to be saying, okay, this time's completely different. No opposition from us, Trump and Musk. I mean, it's really, really important that Musk is there because Musk, remember, he's heading up the Department of Government Efficiency. Potentially, he's going to have a lot of control to regulate the American economy when he is one of the biggest players in the American economy, right? So if you're a competitor of Elon Musk, which Mark Zuckerberg is, then you're going to be pretty terrified that this guy is going to change all the rules to disadvantage you and advantage him. So I think what we're seeing at the moment is all of these people sort of bending the knee, saying, oh, Musk, Trump, be nice to us. We're going to do everything you want. And I mean, that's really worrying, right? If you've got Donald Trump, a candidate who sort of in the run-up to the election wasn't particularly shy about what he wanted to do. He wants to lock up lots of people. He's got no interest in elections. Right? He wants mass deportations. And if you've got all of these different parts of the American establishment, one by one, saying, this time's different. We might have opposed you 4 years ago or 8 years ago, but this time it's completely different. Whatever you want to do, we'll go along with you because the American people have spoken. Now, I mean, we've discussed on the show that sort of that whole Trump derangement syndrome, it was Russia, this is an aberration, an accident must have happened, this must have been sort of fixed from abroad. Some of that was liberal delusion 8 years ago. But at the same time, I think there's a big danger of overcorrecting, whereby suddenly now everyone is like, actually, Donald Trump has a point. Let's let him do whatever he wants to do for the next 4 years. And if you've got the richest man in the world, who, by the way, has all of these government contracts, controls 60% of the satellites in space, this is Elon Musk, of course, and then Donald Trump, someone who has no moral qualms whatsoever, no respect for democracy. And then you've got the entire American corporate establishment saying, whatever you want, we're on your side this time. Then that is a dangerous situation.
Yeah, it is. I mean, just to go back to something that Zuckerberg said, I think in that final excerpt, he's saying there are problems in South America, Europe, and China. He's now comparing the European market for Meta to China. That kind of gets me on edge. He says they're not doing the right things for innovation. What, is the US now going to impose a structural adjustment program? Are they going to occupy us? Are we going to get sanctions? Because they're not innovative enough. We're gonna liberate them and force them to be innovative. Now, I know you think I'm joking. I'm not joking. You've got one of the wealthiest people in the world. He's 40 years old. I think he's the wealthiest person of that age or younger. One of the wealthiest people on the planet doing a 180-degree turn, saying, you know what, we were wrong, hands up, blah, blah, blah. When last year, the incoming president of the United States said he'd spend the rest of his life in jail. The two things are related, people. You don't need a PhD to work that one out. So if you have a world where US tech oligarchs are doing that, literally relocating their business to somewhere, well, not relocating a business, relocating part of their business to a state where, it's just culturally so at odds with California, to appease Trump, I genuinely think we're going to see some really strange stuff happen in this presidency from the perspective of Europe. We're going to see some really strange stuff. We're talking about tariffs now on Canadian exports into America of 25%, something similar with regards to German car exports. Trump is saying that NATO members need to spend 5% of GDP on defense. in this country, that would mean we would need to find another £60 billion to spend on the military, right? It's easy for generals and journalists and influencers to say, yeah, 5%, oh, yeah, whatever. Where are you going to find the 60 billion from? Healthcare budget? Education? Infrastructure? Schools? I mean, it's got to come from somewhere. Really, really, really remarkable moment we're stepping into, I think, after the January the 20th and the inauguration of President-elect Trump. The radical right is becoming a crowded place these days. You've got Nigel Farage, various Tories, and even Tommy Robinson vying to occupy some of the same ground which is to the right of the last Tory government on issues like migration and law and order. But now, a new contender has entered the fray.
The Nazis couldn't cross the channel, but these random men on dinghies seem to cross just fine. Every ship, every plane, every soldier will serve only the interests of the British people. There is no justification for sending men, weapons, or resources to foreign wars when Britain is under siege at home. The military's focus will be singular, the protection of our homeland.
We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields, we shall never surrender. This was their fighting power.
Why? He's talking about taking on the Nazis, the Battle of Britain, blah, blah. He's just showing the Wehrmacht. What? Andrew Tate, TikTok, and Churchill, that's 2025, people. Yes, Andrew Tate is hoping, or so he says, to follow in the footsteps of Winston Churchill and become the UK's next Prime Minister. Launching his political party, the self-proclaimed Top G said this: "Yes, bruv, the Britain Restoring Underlying Values Party will restore the once great Britain. As leader, I am held fully accountable. If the plan has not been actioned within 45 days of power, I will step down from leadership. No delays, charter. Below, join the movement." I'm not going to share the link. So let's have a look at that charter. The heavily AI-dependent manifesto begins with this mission statement. Look around you. Look at what we've become. A nation, he's saying, look around you. What, he's looking at his home in Bucharest, under house, I don't know. A nation that once ruled the waves, that stood as the beacon of strength and freedom, now cowers under its own shadow. Our streets are dangerous, how would you know? Our borders are wide open, and our culture, it's being eroded. This isn't the Britain our ancestors fought for. This isn't the Britain they died for. And this cannot be the Britain we leave to our children. They deserve what brave men died for. They deserve what you've struggled for. We must end the generational failure. Included amongst Tate's policies is what he calls harsh migration control, pledging both an end to small boats arriving in the UK and a start to mass deportations. Tate also wants a 24-hour BBC channel dedicated to live streaming knife crime offenders in solitary confinement. And there are plenty of other policies designed to attract the radical right too. Banning what he calls LGBTQ plus propaganda from schools? Check. Restructuring the BBC, which would take its reporting from X? Check. Making the Union flag compulsory on all streets? Yes, check. But there are also some ideas that would probably find traction with the wider electorate, like making parliamentarians do some actual work. Image on the right, of course, generative AI. Did you know that over 30% of MPs fail to meet basic attendance standards? These are the people meant to lead us, to fight for us. They're not even showing up. It's simple. You don't show up, you're out. MPs will work for the people, not their paychecks. I mean, they should work for the people, but they do need to be paid. Weekly referendums powered by blockchain will give every Briton a voice on the issues that matter most. I don't want a referendum every week. One every 20 years is fine. We're not just taking back our borders, we're taking back our democracy. Tate also takes aim at the failure of successive governments to uphold national infrastructure like schools and high streets, though he says he'd cut foreign aid to pay for that modernisation. Other ideas are very on brand. He promises a specific curriculum for boys, one that includes compulsory boxing and wrestling, to build, quote, warriors, not warriors. The connection isn't totally clear, but he also seems to suggest that some of those warriors would then serve as licensed armed protection for the rich in London. So the new curriculum under Andrew Tate would help assist the formulation of private militias. Now, Tate launched his party on Monday. Less than 24 hours later, a very much manifesting Tate posted this. 1 week into 2025 and I've conquered British politics alongside making the usual $10 million a week. What have you done? Winners win. Attack life and never give up. It's amazing how quickly you can win if you finally try.
I mean, the timing here seems kind of obvious, right? He wants everyone now who is a kind of nutty far right person wants to get the patronage of Elon Musk. So he saw that Elon Musk no longer likes Nigel Farage. Maybe there's $100 million that some other far right nutcase can try and attract from the richest man in the world, who also seems to be very emotionally unstable. So I assume that Andrew Tate launching an AI-generated party, all those AI-generated images, looks like it could have all taken sort of a morning, was a bid to try and get his hands on some Elon Musk money. As far as I understand, I haven't really seen much of a relationship between Elon Musk and Andrew Tate. Although clearly, I mean, if Elon Musk is willing to throw his lot in with Tommy Robinson, then Andrew Tate shouldn't be beyond the pale. But yeah, this seems to me to be a bit of an exercise in trying to grab the attention of the world's richest man, which I suppose isn't a completely, makes sense if that's your grift. I think that's what's going on here.
Yeah, that comparison with Tommy Robinson's interesting. I mean, Tommy Robinson and Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate's like a pure gem Tommy Robinson, right? Less cocaine, more creatine. But that seems to be they seem relatively interchangeable for me. Also, I do find this not funny, because it's not funny at all, actually. Andrew Tate is talking about grooming scandals, exploitation of children, mass sexual assault against children. Of course, he is presently facing charges relating to sex trafficking. I would humbly submit he's probably not the right person to be talking about those kinds of issues. During an interview with Politics Joe, Reform UK leader Nigel Farage made an interesting comparison between himself and another political outsider. And you might be surprised about who he's talking about. Take a look.
We spoke to someone earlier who used to be a Jeremy Corbyn voter, and he's moved towards reform. What do you think the crossover is there, if any?
Oh, well, anti-establishment, obviously. A sense that the giant corporates now dominate the world that we live in, that politics is very much in the pockets of the big corporates. And it's where it's where my thinking and Corbyn's does cross over. I mean, Corbyn was a Eurosceptic right from the very start, because he thought that what Brussels would do is be good for big banks and big businesses and bad for everybody else. Well, he was pretty much right. So there are some crossovers, yeah. And similarly, quite a lot of Trump voters would in the past have thought Bernie Sanders was the guy that they would have voted for. And the unfairness of the economic system as it's currently structured, I think, is at the root of it.
Interesting, right? Interesting. I don't think anybody would have predicted that a few years ago, although Farage has often said that he has things in common with Galloway, for instance. I remember them campaigning on Brexit together. But that is a really interesting overture, I think, particularly to people under 45 who, simply put, have absolutely nothing to gain from the economic status quo. Zero. They might be graduates. They're probably very overqualified for the job they're in. They're not earning enough to buy a home. They're not seeing their wages really buy more over time. They probably aren't going to get a particularly lucrative pension when they retire. If they retire, state pensions are probably going to be kaput by then. Best case scenario, they're waiting to inherit something when their parents pass away. By the way, what a way to live. I can begin to live my life and have housing security when my parents die. Right? That's how screwed up things are right now. We like to look at other countries and go, oh, man, Iran, North Korea. It's really screwed up. You get housing security when your parents die. What a way to live. And I do think for people under 45, some of whom really liked Corbyn, maybe still do, right? Maybe they voted for an independent or even the Greens at the last election. I'm not saying this is a mass phenomenon, but I wonder where those people will be by 2029. They say, you know what? The Tories didn't make my life any better. Labour's not made my life any better. Give them a try. I do think there's going to be a decent number of those people. Of course, that general election is a long way away, 4.5 years away, possibly. So, predictions are a fool's game. Last week, Elon Musk was going to give Reform £78 million, $100 million. And then, of course, over the weekend, he told Farage he wasn't the right man to lead the party. Who knows? Political projects from the outside, insurgents, the wheels can come off really quickly. But right now, Reform are polling really, really well. They might even finish second, according to some polls. They could get 100 plus MPs. And I think this is a real challenge. The gauntlet is being put down now to the left, progressives. What is the offer to the young person who doesn't ever see themselves getting on the property ladder, who's 50, 60,000 pounds worth of student debt, they see no future for themselves in this country? What is the offer to them? You can't just call these people racist and bigots and all that stuff and expect that to work. That's not going to feed them, right? That's not going to pay the student loan repayments. That's not going to pay the council tax. It's not good enough. You might think that, you might believe it. It's not adequate ahead of that next general election. If you've enjoyed watching this evening, you know what to do. Go to novaramedia.com/support. Help us build that new media for different politics. My goodness, we need it. And of course, thanks for watching this evening. Come back tomorrow for another live show at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.